From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We've secured the oil, and therefore a small number of U.S. troops will remain in the area where they have the oil. And we're going to be protecting it, and we'll be deciding what we're going to do with it in the future.
As President Trump announces sanctions will be lifted on Turkey following its invasion of northern Syria, he admits some U.S. troops will remain in the region to protect oil fields in Syria. We'll speak to Andrew Bacevich, president of the newly formed Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Then to Capitol Hill, where Republican lawmakers stormed into a secure room at the Capitol to disrupt the impeachment proceedings against President Trump.
But the tactics are in an effort to delay the inevitable. They are a response to just damaging and pulverizing testimony yesterday from a courageous ambassador and Bill Taylor. But they will not stop us in pursuing the truth.
We'll go to Capitol Hill for the latest on the impeachment proceedings. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump said Wednesday sanctions will be lifted on Turkey as a ceasefire remains in place in northern Syria. Turkey invaded the region earlier this month after Trump withdrew U.S. support for Syrian Kurds who'd helped the U.S. fight ISIS. More than 11,000 Kurds died in that campaign. While President Trump had vowed to remove U.S. forces from Syria, he acknowledged on Wednesday that some U.S. troops will stay to guard the oil fields.
A small number of U.S. troops will remain in the area where they have the oil, and we're going to be protecting it, and we'll be deciding what we're going to do with it in the future. Let someone else fight over this long, blood-stained sand.
Russian and Turkish forces have agreed to joint patrols along the Syrian-Turkish border after Presidents Erdogan and Putin met in Sochi, Russia, Tuesday, and agreed to a plan that would force Syrian Kurdish forces to retreat from a wide swath of the region. The United Nations reports Turkey's offensive displaced over 176,000 people, including nearly 80,000 children. Meanwhile, in Geneva, Switzerland, a Syrian Kurdish man set himself on fire outside the headquarters of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Wednesday. He was airlifted to a hospital in Lausanne. We'll have more on this crisis in Syria after headlines. On Capitol Hill, Republican lawmakers stormed a closed congressional hearing room Wednesday, disrupting the House impeachment investigation and preventing a Pentagon official from testifying for 5 hours. The protest violated House rules, including a ban on cell phones and other electronic devices inside a room known as the SCIF, or Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. Meanwhile, Trump continues to lash out at the impeachment investigation. On Wednesday, he blasted the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, as a never-Trumper, one day after Taylor told Congress Trump withheld hundreds of millions of dollars of military aid to Ukraine in a bid to force its leaders to incriminate Trump's political rival, Joe Biden. In an angry tirade on Twitter, Trump warned of a growing number of Republican critics tweeting, "Watch out for them, they are human scum." Trump tweeted. This comes as the New York Times is reporting top Ukrainian officials were told in early August about the delay of military aid, undercutting one of President Trump's main arguments that he hadn't engaged in a quid pro quo. And the Associated Press reports that in May, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spent hours with his advisors in discussing Trump's pressure campaign to force him to investigate Joe Biden. Later in the broadcast, we'll go to Capitol Hill for the latest on the impeachment investigation. In Manhattan, a personal attorney for Donald Trump told a federal court Wednesday the president could neither be investigated for a crime nor prosecuted, even for murder. The argument by Trump's attorney, William S. Consovoy, came as he sought to quash a subpoena seeking the president's private financial records about hush money payments made to adult film star Stormy Daniels ahead of the 2016 election. During Wednesday's hearing, Judge Denny Chin asked Consovoy about Trump's infamous comment in 2016 that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan and not lose any voters.
And what's your view on the Fifth Avenue example? The local authorities couldn't investigate, they couldn't do anything about it?
I think once a president is removed from office, any local authority, this is not a permanent immunity.
Well, I'm talking about while in office.
No.
That's the hypo. Nothing could be done. That's your position.
That is correct.
A lawyer for Manhattan's district attorney's office responded, quote, "There is no such thing as presidential immunity for tax returns," and, quote, "they're making this up." In Chile, the death toll from anti-government protests has risen to 18 as concessions by President Sebastián Piñera failed to quell anger over rising inequality, the high cost of living, and privatization. On Wednesday, a 4-year-old child and adult were killed after an unidentified driver rammed a crowd of protesters in the city of San Pedro de la Paz. This comes amidst mounting reports of brutality and torture by Chilean authorities. Chile's National Institute of Human Rights says police or soldiers have killed at least 5 of the protesters. In Spain, authorities have exhumed the body of fascist dictator Francisco Franco from a state-run mausoleum to be reburied in a private family vault. Franco oversaw a brutal 40-year dictatorship until his death in 1975. This is Spanish historian and former political prisoner under Franco's dictatorship, Nicolás Sánchez Albornoz.
It was time to move him. We've waited many decades for Franco to disappear from this monument, which in and of itself was the shame of Spain. All the dictators of Franco's ilk have vanished from Europe. Hitler, Mussolini, and we're not honored with such tombs. The truth is, the contradiction was obvious between a democracy and a monument dedicated to the cult of a man who was the opposite of democratic.
In London, lawyers for WikiLeaks co-founder Julian Assange are warning of a blow to press freedom worldwide after a court denied Assange's request for a delay in his U.S. extradition hearing scheduled for February. Assange, who's been jailed by British authorities since he was dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy by London police in April, appeared dazed and frail at a court appearance Monday, struggling to say his own name and birthday before telling a judge, quote, "I can't think properly." Human rights groups have warned Assange has suffered psychological torture in British custody. This is Niels Melzer, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, who visited Assange last May in London's Belmarsh prison.
I spoke with him for an hour just to get a good first impression. Then we had a physical examination for an hour by our forensic expert, and then we had a 2-hour psychiatric examination. And all the 3 of us had the same impression, and well, I had certainly an impression, and the medical doctors had a diagnosis. We all came to the conclusion that he showed all the symptoms that are typical for a person that has been exposed to psychological torture over an extended period of time.
Julian Assange faces up to 175 years in prison if he's extradited to the United States to face hacking charges and 17 counts of violating the World War I-era Espionage Act. Elsewhere in Britain, police have launched one of the largest murder investigations in decades after the bodies of 39 people were discovered in the back of a tractor trailer at an industrial park east of London. The truck had a refrigerator unit. It was not immediately clear if the victims froze to death or suffocated. The Essex Police Department said the deaths were likely the result of human trafficking. A police spokesperson said the truck had a Bulgarian license plate and entered the UK on October 19th.
Emergency services attended, but sadly all 39 people inside the container had died. Early indications suggest that one of these people was a teenager. The rest are believed to be adults. A murder investigation was launched, and the lorry driver, a 25-year-old man from Northern Ireland, was arrested on suspicion of murder and remains in police custody.
All the people who died are Chinese. Back in the United States, a Honduran immigrant has filed a lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security in Connecticut, charging she was forced into sexual slavery by an immigration agent who threatened her with deportation. The woman, identified in the federal lawsuit as Jane Doe, says she was first recruited by ICE agent Wilfredo Rodriguez in 2006 to become an informant after her brother was arrested for entering the U.S. without documentation. She says Rodriguez later forced her into sex, warning she she'd be deported if she didn't obey, and at one point threatening her with a gun. She says she was raped by Rodriguez as often as 4 times a week over a 7-year period, becoming pregnant 3 times. A spokesperson for ICE declined to comment on the lawsuit, but confirmed Rodriguez no longer works for ICE. In Louisiana, relatives of construction workers who were killed when the half-built Hard Rock Hotel in New Orleans collapsed earlier this month are suing the companies behind the disaster. The families say the 18-story building was poorly designed and unsafely built by unlicensed contractors and non-union labor. Its collapse on October 12th left 3 workers dead and dozens injured. Meanwhile, an immigrant worker at the site who was injured after falling 3 stories was arrested by ICE agents just 2 days after narrowly surviving the disaster. Lawyers say Delmer Ramirez-Palma needs surgery, but has yet to receive proper medical attention as he awaits deportation to Honduras in an ICE jail in Oakdale, Louisiana. Ramirez-Palma's arrest came shortly after he described his injuries to a Spanish-language television station. California's largest energy utilities are planning a new round of power cuts that'll bring blackouts to hundreds of thousands of homes and businesses over the next 2 days. Pacific Gas and Electric says dry and windy conditions are forcing it to cut power to more than 500,000 people in Northern California in order to prevent a repeat of last year's devastating Camp Fire, which killed 85 people after poorly maintained PG&E transmission lines sparked the blaze. Meanwhile, Southern California Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric are planning to shut off power to more than 300,000 customers after a fire in the western Los Angeles neighborhood of Pacific Palisades damaged multi-million-dollar hillside homes. Climate scientists say greenhouse gas emissions are making California hotter and drier, leading to bigger and more frequent fires. In Pittsburgh, President Trump touted his administration's support for the natural gas industry Wednesday, praising the growth of fracking wells in Pennsylvania and defending his plan to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord. During his keynote address to the Shale Insight Energy Conference, Trump also praised his administration's construction of new barriers on the southern border.
And we're building a wall on the border of New Mexico, and we're building a wall in Colorado. We're building a beautiful wall, a big one that really works.
In response, Colorado's Governor Jared Polis tweeted, "Colorado doesn't border Mexico. Good thing Colorado now offers free full-day kindergarten so our kids can learn basic geography," he quoted. Ahead of Trump's arrival, Pittsburgh police arrested 14 people as they held a sit-in protest blocking a bridge near the Shale Insight Conference. The protest was led by Jewish leaders who marched behind a banner reading, "Our solidarity will defeat white nationalists." It came almost exactly 1 year after a gunman armed with an AR-15 assault rifle opened fire inside the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, killing 11 Jewish worshippers. Just ahead of the shooting, the gunman posted a racist screed echoing President Trump's language about an invasion of immigrants. This is Dov Kent of the group Jewish Action, who led Wednesday's protest.
We know that the violence from the state that is separating immigrant families is connected to the vigilante violence that is killing Jews in synagogues, black people in churches, and Muslim people on the streets. We know as a Jewish community that our safety is dependent on the safety of all people. And that is why we are here as Jews in Pittsburgh 1 year after the most anti-Semitic shooting that has ever happened in this country to say that our safety matters.
And on Capitol Hill, lawmakers on the House Financial Services Committee grilled Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg Wednesday over the social media giant's plans to launch a cryptocurrency called Libra that would reshape the world's financial system. They also blasted Zuckerberg over Facebook's policy allowing politicians to lie in political advertisements. Michigan Congressmember Rashida Tlaib said she feared far-right hate groups were using Facebook event pages to incite violence against Muslims and other minorities, including death threats directed at her office. This is New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez questioning Zuckerberg.
One more question. In your ongoing dinner parties with far-right figures, some of who advance the conspiracy theory that white supremacy is a hoax, did you discuss so-called social media bias against conservatives, and do you believe there is a bias?
Congresswoman, So I don't remember everything that was in the question.
That's all right. I'll move on. Can you explain why you've named the Daily Caller, a publication well documented with ties to white supremacists, as an official fact checker for Facebook?
Congresswoman, sure. We actually don't appoint the independent fact checkers. They go through an independent organization called the Independent Fact Checking Network that has a rigorous standard for who they allow to serve as a fact checker.
So you would say that white supremacist-tied publications meet a rigorous standard for fact-checking? Thank you.
Congresswoman, I would say that we're not the one assessing that standard. The International Fact-Checking Network is the one who is setting that standard.
To see our discussion with Roger McNamee, a former mentor to Mark Zuckerberg, an early investor in Facebook, who's since become one of the company's most vocal critics and author of the book Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. You can go to democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin today's show in the Middle East. President Trump has announced sanctions will be lifted on Turkey as a ceasefire remains in place in northern Syria. Turkey invaded the region earlier this month after Trump withdrew support for Syrian Kurds who'd helped the U.S. fight the Islamic State. While Turkey has halted its military offensive, it's retaining control of Syrian land seized since October 9th. On Tuesday, Turkey reached an agreement with Russia that would force Syrian Kurdish forces to retreat from a wide swath of the Syrian-Turkish border. Under the deal, Turkey and Russia would carry out joint patrols of the border region. On Wednesday, President Trump vowed to pursue a new course for the United States.
How many Americans must die in the Middle East in the midst of these ancient sectarian and tribal conflicts? After all of the precious blood and treasure America has poured into the deserts of the Middle East, I am committed to pursuing a different course, one that leads to victory for America.
Move here. While President Trump had vowed to remove U.S. troops from Syria, he did acknowledge that some U.S. troops would stay to guard oil fields.
We've secured the oil, and therefore a small number of U.S. troops will remain in the area where they have the oil. And we're going to be protecting it, and we'll be deciding what we're going to do with it in the future.
The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights has reported dozens of people have been killed in Turkey's offensive. The United Nations has said 176,000 people have been displaced, including nearly 80,000 children. Critical civilian infrastructure has been damaged. The Turkish assault also led to a number of former ISIS fighters escaping from jail in northern Syria. On Wednesday, President Trump claimed the ISIS fighters had been, quote, largely recaptured.
There were a few that got out, a small number, relatively speaking, and they've been largely recaptured.
But on Tuesday, U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper acknowledged more than 100 ISIS fighters have escaped.
Based on the intelligence we have, the reporting we have, of the 11,000 or so detainees that were in prisons in northeast Syria, we've only had reports of a little bit more than 100 that have escaped.
Esper was speaking on CNN. We're joined now by Andrew Bacevich, co-founder of the new think tank Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He's the author of several books, including his latest Twilight of the American Century and America's War for the Greater Middle East, A Military History. He's Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History at Boston University. He's also a retired colonel and Vietnam veteran. His latest article for The Spectator USA is headlined, "Does Trump have a better idea than endless wars?" Well, let's begin there. Andrew Bacevich, can you respond to President Trump pulling the U.S. troops away from this area in northern Syria, though saying he will keep them to guard oil fields?
Well, first of all, I think it's very we should avoid taking anything that he says at any particular moment too seriously. Clearly, he is all over the map on almost any issue that you can name. I found his comment about taking the oil in that part of Syria as if we're going to decide how to dispose of it to be striking. And yet, of course, it sort of harkens back to his campaign statement that about the Iraq war, that we ought to have taken Iraq's oil as a way of paying for that war. So I just caution against taking anything he says that seriously. That said, clearly, a recurring theme to which he returns over and over and over again is his determination to end what he calls endless wars. He clearly has no particular strategy or plan for how to do that, but he does seem to be insistent on pursuing that objective. And here, I think, we begin to get to the real significance of the controversy over Syria and our abandonment of the Kurds. Let's stipulate the U.S. abandonment of the Kurds was wrong. It was callous. It was immoral. It was not the first betrayal by the United States in our history, but the fact that there were others certainly doesn't excuse this one. But apart from those concerned about the humanitarian aspect of this crisis, and not for a second do I question the sincerity of people who are worried about the Kurds, it seems to me that the controversy has gotten as big as it is in part because members of the foreign policy establishment in both parties are concerned about what an effort to end endless wars would mean for the larger architecture of U.S. national security policy, which has been based on keeping U.S. troops in hundreds of bases around the world, maintaining a huge military budget, a pattern of interventionism. Trump seems to think that that has been a mistake, particularly in the Middle East. I happen to agree with that critique. And I think that it is a fear that he could somehow engineer a fundamental change in U.S. policy is what really has the foreign policy establishment nervous.
Well, as you mentioned, Professor Bacevich, Trump has come under bipartisan criticism for this decision to withdraw troops from northern Syria. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell was one of the many Republicans to criticize Trump for his decision. In an opinion piece in the Washington Post, McConnell writes, quote, "We saw humanitarian disaster and a terrorist free-for-all after we abandoned Afghanistan in the 1990s, laying the groundwork for 9/11. We saw the Islamic State flourish in Iraq after President Barack Obama's retreat. We will see these things anew in Syria and Afghanistan if we abandon our partners and retreat from these conflicts before they are won." He also writes, quote, "As neo-isolationism rears its head on both the left and the right, we can expect to hear more talk of endless wars. But rhetoric cannot change the fact that wars do not just end. Wars are won or lost." So, Professor Bacevich, could you respond to that and how accurate you think an assessment of that is, both what he says about Afghanistan and what's likely to happen now with the U.S. withdrawal?
I think in any discussion of our wars, ongoing wars, it's important to set them in some broader historical context than Senator McConnell will probably entertain. I mean, to a very great extent, not entirely, but to a very great extent, we created the problems that exist today through our reckless use of American military power. People like McConnell, and I think other members of the political establishment, even members of the mainstream media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, have yet to reckon with the catastrophic consequences of the U.S. invasion of Iraq back in 2003. And if you focus your attention at that start point, you can choose another start point, but if you focus your attention at that start point, then it seems to me that leads you to a different conclusion about the crisis that we're dealing with right now. That is to say, People like McConnell want to stay the course. They want to maintain a U.S. presence in Syria, a U.S. military presence. But if we look at what the U.S. military presence in that region, not simply Syria, has produced over the course of almost 2 decades, then you have to ask yourself, how is it that we think that simply staying the course is going to produce any more positive results? It is appalling what Turkey has done to Syrian Kurds and the casualties they have inflicted and the number of people that have been displaced. But guess what? The casualties that we inflicted and the number of people that we displaced far outnumbers what Turkey has done over the last week or so. So I think that we need to push back against this tendency to oversimplify the circumstance, because oversimplifying the circumstance doesn't help us fully appreciate the causes of this mess that we're in.
We're going to break, then come back to our discussion. We're talking to Professor Andrew Bacevich, retired colonel, Vietnam War veteran, co-founder of the Quincy Institute, a New Washington think tank, author of several books, including Twilight of the American Century, professor emeritus at Boston University. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with him in a minute. By Fridge. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In a moment, we're going to be going to talk about the impeachment proceedings. But right now, we're sticking with Professor Andrew Bacevich, professor emeritus at Boston University, who has formed a new group called the Quincy Institute. And we're going to ask him about that as well. But we're talking about the latest developments right now in northern Syria. Presidents Erdogan and Putin met in Sochi, Russia. They've agreed that Turkish and Russian forces will now patrol the area of northern Syria, pushing out the Kurds in that region. As a result of the U.S. pulling out U.S. troops there, over 175,000 Kurds have been displaced. There is a Democratic-Republican consensus attacking President Trump for his sudden action. But I'd like now to turn to Democratic Congressmember California Ro Khanna, who has long advocated for withdrawal of U.S. troops from the Middle East. We spoke to him earlier this month and asked him why he was critical of Trump's decision to withdraw from Syria.
We can't just get involved in a place and then walk away and not have some moral responsibility. We have a moral responsibility not just to the Kurds who fought with us against ISIS. We have a moral responsibility to accept Syrian refugees. We have a moral responsibility to help rebuild a society that was ravaged by civil war where we were involved. Well, I have called for responsible withdrawal, but not a withdrawal that is oblivious to human life in Syria or to American interests in Syria. President Trump, at the very first instance, should have notified the Kurds about what our intentions were and notified our allies.
So that's California Congressmember Ro Khanna. Professor Bacevich, if you could respond to what you've talked about, the poking of this beast, of the pro-war establishment. Rarely Rarely do you have Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, speaking out in the Senate against President Trump, not to mention his views being echoed by many Democrats. Ro Khanna is one of the few who is raising concern about just condemning Trump for withdrawing the troops, but he's saying it's the way he did it. Can you respond to him talking about the moral imperatives the U.S. has now, having been there protecting the Kurds for a long period of time?
Well, I think Congressman Khanna makes the essential point that there is a need for the United States to lower its military profile in the greater Middle East because our military actions have been mightily destructive. They have not advanced our interests. They have not advanced the cause of peace and security. But yes, that needs to be done responsibly. And this president is incapable of actually acting in a responsible way if that means thinking ahead of time about what series of steps could lead to a U.S. withdrawal while minimizing the negative impact on people like the Kurds. And sadly, of course, not that Trump seems inclined to take advice from anybody, but sadly, Trump is surrounded by so-called advisors who are themselves incapable or unwilling to think about such a deliberate and carefully thought out withdrawal. And so we have this president who's given to impulsive statements and impulsive actions, who doesn't have people around him who can help correct that tendency. But what Congressman Khanna said is exactly correct in my judgment.
Well, during his address Wednesday, President Trump also said the Middle East was less safe now than it was prior to U.S. intervention in the region.
We have spent $8 trillion on wars in the Middle East, never really wanting to win those wars. But after all that money was spent and all those lives lost, the young men and women gravely wounded so many, the Middle East is less safe, less stable, and less secure than before these conflicts began.
So that's Trump speaking Wednesday. I'd like to go back now to the Democratic presidential debate earlier this month. Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren said U.S. troops should withdraw from the Middle East, but her campaign later issued a statement saying she meant to say not the Middle East, but Syria. This is what Warren said during the debate.
I think that we ought to get out of the Middle East. I don't think we should have troops in the Middle East, but we have to do it the right way, the smart way. What this president has done is that he has sucked up to dictators. He has made impulsive decisions that often his own team doesn't understand. He has cut and run on our allies, and he has enriched himself at the expense of the United States of America. In Syria, he has created a bigger than ever humanitarian crisis. He has helped ISIS get another foothold, a new lease on life.
So that's Senator Elizabeth Warren speaking earlier this month at the Democratic presidential debate. Professor Bacevich, could you respond to that? And in particular, the Warren campaign saying that she meant Syria and not the Middle East, after she clearly said during the debate the U.S. should withdraw from the Middle East.
Yeah, I regret that the campaign felt called upon to correct her. And, that this is what she actually meant to say. It seemed to me that what she said is correct. That is to say, she said, we need to get out the right way and the smart way. That is to say, there needs to be a plan. There needs to be a series of steps. There needs to be an assessment of risk. There needs to be some kind of a backstop. And quite frankly, I think she's probably smart enough in my dealings with her that she would be able to put together with her advisors that smart plan. So why her campaign felt obliged to walk back that statement is beyond me.
And of course, you're speaking to us from her district, from her state, from Massachusetts. You're one of her constituents. Well, you know, she was responding to Tulsi Gabbard. So I'd like to turn to her political rival, Democratic presidential hopeful, Hawaii Congressmember Tulsi Gabbard, speaking also at the debate.
Donald Trump has the blood of the Kurds on his hand, but so do many of the politicians in our country from both parties who have supported this ongoing regime change war in Syria that started in 2011, along with many in the mainstream media who have been championing and cheerleading this regime change war. As president, I will end these regime change wars by doing two things: ending the draconian sanctions that are really a modern-day siege, the likes of which we are seeing Saudi Arabia wage against Yemen, that have caused tens and thousands of Syrian civilians to die and to starve. And I would make sure that we stop supporting terrorists like al-Qaeda in Syria, who've been the ground force in this ongoing regime change war.
So that's Tulsi Gabbard. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has accused the 2020 Democratic presidential candidate, Gabbard, of being groomed by Russia to run as a third-party candidate, again without offering any evidence. In response, Gabbard said, quote, "You, the queen of warmongers, embodiment of corruption, and personification of the rot that has sickened the Democratic Party for so long, have finally come out from behind the curtain," Gabbard said, addressing Hillary Clinton. Andrew Bacevich, can you talk about this brewing battle right now?
Well, I don't want to get in the middle of these smears being flung back and forth. And I understand that Congresswoman Gabbard is in some respects a radioactive figure these days. But it seems to me that she was making a very essential point. You know, the Democrats are in the middle of a campaign to oust the most incompetent president that we have ever had. And therefore, there is a strong tendency to charge Trump with having screwed everything up. And what Gabbard is pointing out, and it is an important, legitimate point, is that the mess that is the Middle East today is a product of actions caused by several administrations from both parties. So this is not a situation that Trump created. Indeed, it's a situation that Trump inherited. In his bumbling way, he seems to have a wish to extricate the United States from this mess, although, as I said previously, he actually has no idea how to do that in a meaningful way. But I think it is important for us to not lose sight of the fact that the catastrophic trajectory of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is the responsibility of both parties and several administrations. If we can't acknowledge that history, then it seems to me we're not going to be able to make the necessary correctives.
Well, I'd like to ask about the situation in Afghanistan. When Trump took office, there were about 8,400 troops in Afghanistan. But under his administration, that number has risen to about 14,000. The New York Times has reported the U.S. has been quietly withdrawing some troops from the country. On Monday, the top American commander in Afghanistan said about 2,000 U.S. troops have left Afghanistan over the last year. There are still between 12,000 and 13,000 U.S. troops stationed in the country. Meanwhile, the United Nations had said civilian casualties have reached a new high in Afghanistan. A record 4,300 civilians were injured or killed in the country between July and September this year. These are the highest figures since the UN began counting in 2009. This comes as the U.S. is intensifying its air war. Last month, U.S. Air Force aircraft dropped 948 missiles and bombs, more than in any month in the last 5 years. So, Professor Bacevich, could you comment on that? And how is it that if Trump is intent on ending endless wars, he increased the U.S. troop presence in Afghanistan?
Well, again, you know, if we are intending to try to find consistency in the Trump administration, we're going to look for a long, long time. And there clearly is a gap between the rhetoric of endless war, ending endless wars, and the reality of what the United States military has been doing. But what really matters here, it seems to me, is to acknowledge that the U.S. military effort in Afghanistan, going on for 18 years now, has in fact failed. Remember, we launched this as Operation Enduring Freedom. The name has been changed since, but Operation Enduring Freedom. And we entered Afghanistan with some coalition partners intent on creating a stable, modern, democratic state that would recognize human rights. We have had the numbers of troops on the ground over the course of time has varied, gone up, gone down, gone back up. Fact of the matter is, we have failed in Afghanistan. So it seems to me that both the politically appropriate and also the moral course of action is to acknowledge that failure and again to undertake a deliberate, smart withdrawal from this war. There have, of course, been peace negotiations underway with the Taliban for some period of time. There was a moment when it appeared that the Trump administration was fairly close to closing a deal with the Taliban. I'm not a Taliban apologist. I regret the fact that they may well end up regaining control of that country. But I don't believe that the United States or anybody else is in a position to dictate the future of Afghanistan. We are not the first empire to have imagined that we could do that and to have come up short. And finally, again, the failure in Afghanistan is partly Trump's failure, but it is also a failure of Barack Obama and George W. Bush and the various people who advised them and the various generals who have been assigned responsibility for waging this war, none of whom have been able to accomplish their assigned mission.
Professor Bacevich, you're going to stay with us for our impeachment discussion, but just very briefly, we identified you as the head of a new organization, the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Is it accurate to say this will be a new anti-war think tank?
Yes. Not sure why Washington needs another think tank, but we think it can. We think that there is a need to introduce a different perspective in the debate over U.S. national security policy. We are anti-war. We are not anti-military. We are not isolationist. We are in favor of dialogue, creative diplomacy to try to solve problems and advance the cause of peace. What the foreign policy establishment has done for us over the past 30, 40 years has done nothing to advance the cause of peace. And we think that the United States, as the most powerful country in the world, can do better.
Andrew Bacevich, want you to stay with us for our discussion about impeachment. Retired Colonel, Vietnam War vet, co-founder of the Quincy Institute. When we come back, we go to Capitol Hill, where Republican lawmakers stormed into a secure room to disrupt the impeachment proceedings of President Trump. Stay with us.
Did the whole world was loaded? Waiting about bodies ever coming down now. I just want to get along. I just want to get along. I just want to get along. I look up. The heads fly over. I see a boy I know, his hair's on fire. The whole world I discovered. If you're so special, why aren't you dead?
I Just Want to Get Along by the Breeders. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Republican lawmakers stormed a closed hearing room Wednesday, disrupting the House impeachment investigation into President Donald Trump and delaying a Pentagon official's testimony. In an extraordinary chain of events, dozens of Republican Congress members pushed into a secure hearing room as Laura Cooper, the U.S. defense official who oversees Ukraine and Russia matters, was due to testify. A 5-hour standoff ensued. This is Kansas Republican Representative Roger Marshall being questioned by reporters.
So we just saw maybe 15, 20 Republicans, maybe 30 of us, the whip, led us in there to the Star Room. Schiff walks out. They all walk out. They're not going to let us hear anything. This whole thing is a sham. Now we're just in there yelling and screaming at each other. If this was out open and transparent, then the American public could see exactly what's going on. That's all we're wanting, is we want this to be transparent.
What did Chairman Schiff say?
Nothing. He doesn't have the guts to come talk to us. He does not have the guts to talk to us. He left. He just got up and left. He doesn't have the guts to tell us why we can't come in the room, why he doesn't want this to be transparent. It's the biggest facade, the biggest farce I've ever seen in my life.
Laura Cooper was finally able to testify once the protest ended. California Democrat Eric Swalwell addressed Wednesday's dramatic events.
But the tactics are in an effort to delay the inevitable. They are a response to just damaging and pulverizing testimony yesterday from a courageous ambassador in Bill Taylor. But they will not stop us in pursuing the truth.
The former presidential candidate, Congressmember Swalwell, was referring to Tuesday's explosive testimony by William Taylor, the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine. Taylor told congressional lawmakers the Trump administration held up $391 million in aid to Ukraine for the purpose of pushing Ukraine to incriminate Trump's political rivals, particularly Joe Biden. In Taylor's opening statement, which has been made public, he laid out his interactions with Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union. He's a wealthy Oregon hotel magnate with no diplomatic experience who received the ambassadorship after donating $1 million to Trump's inauguration. Taylor says Ambassador Sondland told him that everything, including security assistance, was dependent on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announcing an investigation into Burisma, the gas company where Joe Biden's son Hunter was a board member. Taylor's testimony offers the most damning evidence so far in the ongoing impeachment inquiry. Well, for more, we're joined by Mitch Jeserich, host of Letters and Politics, heard on KPFA and Around Pacifica Radio, and a Capitol Hill correspondent. Still with us, Andrew Bacevich, co-founder of the Quincy Institute, the new Washington anti-war think tank, who recently wrote a piece for Tom Dispatch headlined "The Real Cover-Up, Putting Donald Trump's Impeachment in Context." But, Mitch, let's go to you first. You're right there on Capitol Hill. Talk about the latest in the impeachment inquiry, the takeover of this room yesterday by this group of Republican, mainly men, and also the significance of Bill Taylor's testimony.
Well, let's begin with what happened yesterday at the SCIF room, is what they call it, and that stands for Sensitive Compartment Information Facility. And Amy, it's just as it sounds. It's a very secured room where briefings behind closed doors with usually highly classified information occurs. True story. I was even told as I was down there outside the room not even to point my microphone in the direction of the doors. And it's, again, as it would sound, a highly secured, impenetrable room that Republicans, about 40 of them, who weren't supposed to really go in there, were able to penetrate. And as you said in the introduction, ended up delaying the testimony of Laura Cooper of the Pentagon for about 5 hours. After about 5 hours, Laura Cooper was able to give her deposition behind closed doors, and it only lasted about 3 hours, one of the shorter depositions that have occurred so far. They wanted to talk to Laura Cooper about what she knew from the Pentagon's angle concerning the withholding of the $391 million of military aid to Ukraine in exchange for these investigations that Rudy Giuliani was pushing Ukraine to do in order to get a meeting with President Trump. So this whole process occurred. It was pretty extraordinary. It really was an act of civil disobedience by Republicans. I've covered in the years past Congress on a day-to-day basis, and I have never seen something like that happen. If you would have told me something like what happened yesterday would have happened, if you would have told me that 10 years ago that would have happened on the Hill, especially by Republicans, I would have never believed it.
And talk about the significance of Bill Taylor's testimony, the top U.S. diplomat, the man who was brought in, and talk about who he is. He didn't even want to be the top diplomat in Ukraine, but the Trump administration convinced him to do it.
Mike Pompeo convinced him to do it, and you're absolutely correct about that. William Taylor is a longtime foreign diplomat. He's worked under different administrations in the past, very much a part of U.S. foreign policy for many years. We say that he led the embassy in Ukraine, not that he was the ambassador, and that's significant because he was appointed on an interim basis to replace Marie Yovanovitch, who was the ambassador to Ukraine. But she was recalled by Donald Trump. And this is important because Marie Yovanovitch was very critical of the Ukrainian prosecutor that Giuliani and Trump wanted to investigate both the Bidens as well as this theory that Ukraine was actually behind the theft of the DNC emails. And it's been reported that Marie Yovanovitch had a very strained relationship with this prosecutor. She accused him of corruption, and he didn't like her whatsoever. So the Trump administration had Marie Yovanovitch recalled. She was replaced by William Taylor. Now, William Taylor is important because you will remember a couple of weeks ago, we got the transcripts of text messages from between William Taylor, Gordon Sondland, and Kurt Volker about trying to create a public meeting between Ukrainian President Zelensky and Donald Trump. And it is William Taylor, you will recall, in these text messages that was raising the alarm. Are we withholding $391 million in order to force these investigations for political gain for the president? He was the one that was raising the alarm. We've had those text messages. What he did on Tuesday at the deposition is he said he filled in some of the other blanks of what happened with actual phone calls that occurred and meetings that occurred. And he painted a picture that it was very much a quid pro quo, and not just for the military aid and not just for the meeting with Donald Trump. He painted a picture that the entire relationship with Ukraine was on the line over these investigations. And that's really significant because we know that Ukraine has basically been perhaps in a low-level civil war ever since 2014, in which the United States is on one side, and obviously Russia is on the other side. And so to suggest anyways that the entire relationship with Ukraine, with the current government, could be on the line if these investigations did not happen, seems to be pretty significant.
And Gordon Sondland, who he is, this Oregon hotel magnate and retail developer, real estate developer, who becomes the U.S. ambassador to the European Union. Talk about his role in all of this and his testimony.
Gordon Sondland plays an important role because, and this is something that William Taylor also said on Tuesday, there became two tracks of foreign policy concerning Ukraine within the administration. One, the more official one that went through the State Department, that went through people like William Taylor and other diplomats. Another one that was spearheaded by Rudy Giuliani and also Gordon Sondland. Gordon Sondland was the one who started coming in and pushing the conditions in order to have a public meeting between Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, that would be conditioned on these two investigations, not just the investigations occurring, but they wanted Zelensky to publicly say that there would be an investigation both into, again, the Bidens, as well as into the theft of the DNC emails. So Gordon Sondland, who is as you indicated, Amy, is the ambassador of the the European Union, became the point person for the president. He was asked by other diplomats, "Who are you to tell us to do anything?" And he said, "Well, it's coming straight from the president." Important to note that Gordon Sondland is the ambassador of the European Union. Ukraine is not a member of the European Union.
Well, I want to bring Professor Andrew Bacevich back into the discussion. Professor Bacevich, if you could comment on what you think this impeachment inquiry is about. You wrote a piece recently for Low Blog headlined "The Real Cover-Up." What is the real cover-up?
Well, first, if I could just very briefly say that Bill Taylor, turns out he's a West Point classmate of mine. And I know him to be a person of impeccable character. And I have to tell you how proud it makes me feel that my classmate has stood up and told the truth at this important juncture of our history. I'm just sort of sitting here busting my buttons in admiration of him. But what's really going on, at some level, of course, what's going on is this pattern of misconduct by Trump and the people around him. He is the worst president in our history. The sooner he leaves office, the better. If he loved our country, he would simply resign and go to Mar-a-Lago and never be seen again, but he won't do that. The point of the piece that you referred to, however, is it's important to acknowledge the extent that there are many sources of corruption that compromise our democracy. And one of them is the foreign money. In the piece you alluded to, I talk about the millions of dollars that the government of Saudi Arabia spends on an annual basis trying to influence people in Washington, D.C. It's sort of honest graft, but it is graft. It's contemptible. And so I hope that if we are in some vague way embarked upon an effort to cleanse our politics, that we'll take a look at the influence of foreign money in our politics on a daily basis.
And Professor Bacevich, what about the criticism that's been made that this impeachment inquiry isn't really about Ukraine, but it's really about, as Professor Sam Moyn of Yale University has said, that Trump's rise, his success in beating Clinton within the appalling rules of the American game, that's really what's been the affront?
I think Professor Moyn is exactly right. Again, there are multiple layers of meaning here. And it is difficult, I think, for us to appreciate what they are and how they interact. But Moyn's point, and I agree with Moyn's point, is that the election of Donald Trump symbolized a rejection of what Moyn refers to as centrism. And I take that word in this context to mean the underlying bipartisan view of the Republicans and the Democrats that expresses itself in many ways. It expresses itself in support for corporate capitalism. It expresses itself in support for a quasi-imperialistic foreign policy. It expresses itself in militarism. And Trump's election, not Trump himself, but his election exposed the extent to which many millions of our fellow citizens have rejected that bipartisan centrism. And the centrists in both parties are determined to restore themselves to their usual place in American politics. That, too, is one of the things that's going on here.
We just have 15 seconds. And Mitch Jeserich, I wanted to go back to you at Capitol Hill. The November discussion now, the possibility that the hearings will become open in November. What does that mean? What's next?
Well, what's happening right now are the depositions, and these depositions are these three committees that are working on this, trying to get the testimony of the people that are coming and testify. Apparently, once this process is over, it'll be referred to the House Judiciary Committee, and then it'll be the House Judiciary Committee that will take up the articles of impeachment. Will there be other hearings from these committees that are doing the depositions? We'll still have to see. We can bet it'll become more public once it gets to the House Judiciary Committee.
We're going to have to leave it there. Mitch Jeserich of KPFA's Letters and Politics, heard on Pacifica Radio, and Andrew Bacevich of the Quincy Institute. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.